Every night, after the building emptied and the last executive badge swiped out, a janitor moved through the silence like a man with two jobs, one that paid the bills, and one that no one had hired him for. Quietly fixing problems the executives didn't even know existed, patching broken workflows, correcting system errors, and leaving everything better than he found it without ever signing his name to any of it. Until one night, the CEO walked in early, caught him in the act, and stood frozen in the doorway, trying to reconcile the mop in his hand with the solution on the screen that her entire engineering team had failed to find for 11 days straight. Marcus Webb was 38 years old with a bachelor's from Penn State, a master's in software architecture, and a PhD he'd earned at night school while working full-time. Credentials that should have had him running an engineering department by now. Except that 18 months ago the firm he gave everything to laid off 340 people on a Tuesday morning with nothing but an email and a 2-week severance check. And he had been one of them, which would have been devastating enough on its own if it hadn't also come 6 weeks after his wife Diane walked out, not out of cruelty, but out of survival, because she'd been drowning in depression for 2 years and finally admitted she couldn't get well, while holding a family together at the same time, leaving Marcus alone with their 7-year-old daughter Amara, a little girl who never once saw her father cry, because he made her breakfast every morning and walked her to school and read to her every night, even when he was so exhausted he could barely hold the book, because falling apart was simply not something he allowed himself to do. But the bills didn't care about his strength, and after 200 applications, 17 interviews, and a final round rejection from Novatech, the one company he'd been quietly following for 3 years, believing in their vision before most people knew their name, he finally did what any man who loves his daughter more than his pride does. He called a cleaning company, got hired the same day, and started showing up at Novatech's office every night at midnight, mopping the floors of the company that didn't want him, wearing earbuds, listening to tech podcast, keeping his mind sharp, refusing to let the job define his ceiling even if it paid his floor, with one singular goal still burning quietly inside him, to find a way back in, never once suspecting that the way back in was already on its way to find him. If you looked up self-made in the dictionary, you might as well find a photo of Janitor, CEO of Novatech at 44, Forbes listed, daughter of Korean immigrants who ran a dry cleaning shop in Koreatown, a woman who had worked 3 jobs to get through college, coded her first product in a studio apartment with no air conditioning, and turned down a $200 million acquisition offer in 2019 because she believed Novatech was worth more. And she was right, because 3 years later it was worth 4 times that number. But success had not made her soft. It had made her precise, the kind of leader who walked floors unannounced at midnight, read every internal report herself, and could smell when someone was hiding a problem from her, which is exactly what was happening right now. Because for 11 straight days, Novatech's core data pipeline, the backbone of their entire enterprise system, had been throwing errors that no one on the engineering team could fully diagnose. Not crashes, not obvious failures, but subtle creeping inconsistencies that only appeared under specific load conditions, and moved every time the team thought they'd isolated the cause. And the lead engineer, a 31-year-old named Preston Hale hired away from a Silicon Valley giant at enormous expense, had already presented 3 different root cause analyses in 8 days, and been wrong every single time. While the board grew nervous, to enterprise clients flagged performance issues, and Diana stopped leaving the office before midnight, which is why on the night everything changed she was on the 34th floor at 1:47 in the morning, alone in the glass-walled server room, staring at a monitor with cold coffee in her hand, reading through error logs for the 5th consecutive night, and she almost didn't notice the cleaning guy. Almost. What happened next started with a mistake. Marcus's mistake, because he didn't realize anyone was still in the building. The security log had shown the floor cleared, so he came in with his cart and his earbuds and was halfway through the engineering section when he passed an open monitor displaying the pipeline error log and stopped. Not because he meant to get involved, not because he was looking for an opportunity, but because something on that screen didn't look right to him, and Marcus was the kind of man who, even with a mop in his hand, could not walk past a problem he understood and pretend he didn't see it. So he leaned in, just to look, and recognized the pattern immediately. Not identical, but structurally similar to a cascading failure he diagnosed at Vertex Solutions 3 years ago, and for hours while it had taken everyone else to weeks. A problem whose root cause had been counterintuitive. A memory allocation sequence that only misfired when 2 specific processes overlapped, under high load, invisible unless you were looking at the timing offsets between nodes, rather than the nodes themselves. Because nobody looked at timing offsets, everyone looked at where the error appeared. But Marcus always looked at when, so he stood there for 30 seconds. Then reached into his pocket and pulled out the small notepad he'd never stopped carrying, and began writing. Just timing notations. Just a rough pattern map. The kind of thing a man does when he genuinely cannot help himself. Completely unaware that Diana Cho had been standing 12 feet behind him for almost a full minute, having heard his cart and stepped to the doorway to see who it was. Now watching in silence as a man in a cleaning uniform with a mop handle leaning against the wall worked through a technical notation with the focused calm of someone who absolutely knew what they were looking at until she finally spoke and said, "What are you seeing?" And Marcus went rigid, turned slowly, recognized her face immediately from every press piece he'd ever read about Novatech, and felt the reflex rise up in him to put the notepad away, apologize, say he was just curious and didn't mean to overstep. But he was tired, not just physically. Tired in the way a man gets when he has spent a year and a half swallowing himself whole, pretending to be less than he was, making himself small so the world would be comfortable around him. Tired while his daughter needed new medication and the school was waiting on a field trip deposit, and Mrs. Flores had gently mentioned she might need to charge more. Tired of walking past problems he could solve, so instead of putting the notepad away he held it up and said, very quietly, "You're looking at the wrong layer. The errors aren't in the pipeline nodes. They're in the handoff timing between your async validation threads. And under normal load the gap is fine. But when you hit concurrent enterprise traffic above a certain threshold, two of your processes are requesting the same memory allocation window, within microseconds of each other. And it's not crashing the system. It's creating phantom confirmation signals that your monitoring tools are reading as successful completions. The data isn't being lost. It's being miscounted." And the room went completely silent, and Diana stared at him and said, "Where did you go to school?" And he said, "Penn State, master's from Carnegie Mellon, PhD in distributed systems architecture. I applied to Novatech 8 months ago and didn't get a call back past round 4. And she looked at the notepad, then at the monitor, then back at him, and said the words, "Show me." Marcus sat down at the terminal, a cleaning company employee, in work clothes, with a mop still leaning against the wall outside, and over the next 40 minutes walked Diana through everything he'd seen, pulling up the timing logs, showing her the microsecond overlap, mapping out the async thread conflict in a way that made the invisible suddenly undeniable, and then doing something no one on the engineering team had managed in 11 days. He found the fix, and the humbling part was that it wasn't a massive overhaul, just a targeted adjustment to the thread scheduling priority, the kind of change that would take a competent engineer to hours to implement and test. The kind of fix that once you saw it made you feel embarrassed you hadn't seen it before. And when it was done, Diana went quiet for a long time before finally asking, "Why are you cleaning floors?" And Marcus told her everything, not with bitterness, not with self-pity, but with the steady factual tone of a man who has processed his situation honestly and is no longer ashamed of any of it, telling her about Vertex, about Diane leaving, about Amara, about the 200 applications and 17 interviews, and coming back to clean the floors of the company that rejected him not out of desperation alone but because staying sharp was the only way he knew how to survive. And Diana didn't speak for almost a full minute after he finished, before saying something that made his chest tighten, telling him that Preston Hale had flagged his file as overqualified and not a culture fit, and that she had signed off on it without reading his portfolio, that it was her mistake and she wanted to correct it. But that wasn't the twist. Because 20 minutes later, when Diana pulled up the original rejected application in the system, Marcus saw something that made the room tilt. Because the rejection email he received 8 months ago hadn't come from HR at all. It had been sent from Preston Hale's personal outbox, before the official HR process had even completed. And the reason became sickeningly clear when they looked closer. Because Marcus's portfolio contained 3 published papers on distributed system optimization that directly overlapped with work Preston had been presenting as his own original research inside Novatech. Meaning Preston hadn't rejected Marcus because he wasn't a fit. He'd rejected him because Marcus was precisely qualified enough to expose the fact that Novatech's lead engineer had been quietly building his entire reputation on ideas he hadn't originated. And Diana sat back in her chair like someone had removed the floor beneath her and said softly, "He's been presenting your architecture concepts as internal innovation." And Marcus said, carefully, "I don't know that for certain." And Diana said, "I do," in the kind of quiet voice that is more serious than any amount of shouting. "I've been reading his reports for 8 months." By 8 a.m. the next morning, Diana had called a full engineering team meeting, And Preston Hale walked in looking like a man who expected to be praised, having heard word that a breakthrough had been made on the pipeline issue overnight, and spent his entire commute preparing to graciously accept credit for his team's persistence, so he did not expect to see a man in street clothes sitting at the conference table next to the CEO. And he certainly did not expect that man to be Marcus Webb, and the blood drained from his face the moment their eyes met. But Diana didn't raise her voice, didn't make a dramatic speech. She was surgical, laying out 3 things on the table without ceremony: Marcus's published papers timestamped and publicly accessible alongside Preston's internal research presentations. The timestamp on the rejection email Preston had sent before HR had even completed their process, and the pipeline fix Marcus had documented the night before, which had already been reviewed by the senior engineers that morning and confirmed as correct. And she asked Preston one question: "Do you have anything you want to say before I speak?" And he tried 3 different responses in 30 seconds. First coincidence, then parallel development, then silence. And Diana turned to the room and said, "Marcus Webb holds a PhD in distributed systems architecture. He has been working a night cleaning shift in this building for the past 5 months. He solved in 40 minutes what this team has been unable to solve in 11 days. And he was removed from our hiring process without my knowledge for reasons that had nothing to do with his qualifications." Before turning back to Preston and saying simply, "You're done here." And the room went completely silent. And then she looked at Marcus and offered him a position. Not entry level, not provisional, but senior systems architect with his own team and compensation commensurate with his experience. And paused to personally apologize to him in front of everyone in that room for the fact that a broken process and someone else's insecurity had cost him 8 months of his life. And Marcus didn't respond immediately, sitting quietly for a moment thinking about Amara's face in the morning, about Mrs. Flores, about the field trip deposit, about every night he put his earbuds in and mopped floors and listened to tech podcast, and refused to become someone who gave up. And then he nodded once, slowly, and said, "I'd like that." 3 weeks later, Marcus walked into Novatech's 34th floor at 9 a.m. not through the service entrance, but through the front lobby, with a badge that had his name and title on it, and a jacket Amara had spent 20 minutes choosing for him the night before, with the gravity of a 7-year-old who understood somehow that this morning mattered. And when he got to his new desk, an actual desk with 2 monitors and a nameplate, he found a sticky note from the overnight cleaning crew that said, "We knew you weren't just a cleaner. Good luck, man." And he sat down, took a breath, and opened his laptop. And that evening he picked Amara up from school himself, for the first time in 5 months. And she ran to him the way kids run when they don't care who's watching. Full speed, no hesitation. Like the distance between them was something to be fixed as fast as possible. And he caught her and held on longer than usual until she said, "Dad, why do you smell like the office?" And he laughed, the real kind, the kind that had been missing for a while, and said, "Because that's where I work now, baby." And she pulled back and looked at him with those serious eyes she'd inherited from him and said, "The office where they didn't want you?" And he said simply they were wrong, and they figured it out. And she considered this for a moment with the particular wisdom of children, who often understand more than we think, before deciding that was sufficient enough and asking, "Can we get pizza?" And he said, "Yeah," standing up with her still in his arms, "We can get pizza."